So let's begin. Mr. Phillips?
Great. Well, good evening and welcome to this evening's presentation. My name is Pat Phillips. I'm the Vice President of the Green Mountain Audubon Society, and we're one of several chapters of underneath the aegis of Audubon Vermont, and we cover Chittenden, Grand Isle, and Franklin counties. This evening's program is one of a number of different programs that we have offered over the course of the year, in addition to our outings. And so if you're interested in future programs or participating in one of our future outings, just go to our website, which is greenmountainaudubon.org, and look under events. And we would love to have you join us on future events. So again, thank you for being here this evening. And I'm going to turn it over to Tom G. Michello, our Master of Ceremonies. Tom.
Thank you, Pat. Tonight is my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, who joins us from her research and her participation in the Northern New York Audubon chapter since 2020. Hyla Howe is a graduate student at UVM, and not only is she a board member in the New York Audubon chapter, but her research is focused there, particularly in the Adirondacks, and you'll learn a lot about it. For the last 3 summers, she has been studying bobolinks and other grassland birds in the Champlain Valley, eastern high peaks, and the Tri-Lakes region. And her research takes an interdisciplinary approach. She's examining the bobolinks populations and the farmer attitudes towards grassland bird conservation. And that's being done in order to have more effective outreach and incentive programs. She is in her final semester of her master's degree at the Rubenstein School, and she's excited to tell the story tonight to you of the farmers and birds linked by changing regional land use patterns and the ways that we can best support them. So without any further ado, I turn the program over to Hyla Howe.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone who's here on a Thursday night, and thanks to Green Mountain Audubon Society for having me. Thanks especially to Eliza for making this all happen. So as Tom mentioned, I'm a master's student in the Rubenstein School. I'm studying with Allan Strong, who I'm sure many of you on this call are familiar with. And as a board member for Northern New York Audubon Society, I'm especially excited to present this research on the other side of the lake. I was just saying before this meeting started, I feel like there's such a disconnect between, Vermont and Northern New York, even though we're connected so closely by just a small lake in the middle. This is the first time I'm really sharing these preliminary findings with anyone. I was actually writing the results section as I was making this PowerPoint. So this is brand new information, and I'm really excited to share it with you all tonight. I grew up in South Central Pennsylvania in Lancaster, PA, and it's a pretty agricultural area, but unfortunately it's rapidly transitioning to more of a suburban landscape. And, throughout middle school and high school, and then in the years when I was coming back during breaks in college, my bike was my primary mode of transportation. And I just really witnessed so much, land use change that kind of broke my heart. So I ended up going to school at Paul Smith's College and got a degree in biology, spent 4 years getting lost in the mountains. But I did find that I really missed those open agricultural landscapes. And it took a little while for me to find my way back and find out how I could really combine the two. For the first few years after I graduated from undergrad, I worked in environmental education. And I'm so grateful for those experiences because they really taught me a couple important things. First of all, I learned how powerful of a tool birds can be for connecting people with the natural world. It really opens up so many important conversations like climate change and land use patterns and biodiversity loss. And it can make those bigger issues, hopeful if you see them through the lens of birding. The photo on the left is a grassland bird bike ride that I led a couple summers ago. And the photo on the right is a birdhouse building program that we put on I think in July of 2021. So those were just fun ways to get people out into the field, learning about birds and learning about these landscapes. So as I transitioned out of environmental ed and towards grad school, I knew that I really wanted to make my research community-based and have, a lot of opportunity for outreach and education and connection. I connected with Michaeli Glennon, who works at the Adirondack Watershed Institute, and she hired me in 2021 to do research on a hayfield in Lake Placid and study bobolinks. And this really was such a full circle moment for me to be able to, work with farmers and work in kind of wildlife conservation on working lands. So a lot of you are probably familiar with the bobolink. They're fairly common in Vermont. They really require large open habitats. They're a grassland obligate songbird. They have a really distinctive call. They're called the R2D2 bird because it's kind of this robotic, twinkly call. People say that they look like the founding fathers because they have that wig. Other people say that they look like they're wearing a tuxedo backwards. But they are very charismatic, widespread throughout my study area, and they're heavily impacted by agricultural practices. So even though I did study meadowlarks, savanna sparrows, and bobolinks, for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on bobolinks. And the photo on the left is actually a nest that I found when I was out in the field, which was really exciting. But they nest on the ground, usually under the cover of forbs, kind of out in the open in these hayfields. So they're very vulnerable. They have a fairly large range. They breed, traditionally they bred in the prairie. We've lost about 99% of the native tallgrass prairie out west. And so habitat in the Northeast is really significant for their continued survival. They can stretch the whole way over into the Maritimes and Canada, and they actually have a really long migration. So the orange area that's highlighted is their breeding ground. The blue areas are their wintering ground down in South America. And the yellow is their migratory pathway. So because they have such a long migration compared to others like the savanna sparrow, they have a much shorter window in which they can breed. Bobolinks are also a tipping point species, which means that they've lost 2/3 of their population in the last 50 years and are projected to lose another half in the next 50 years without proper intervention. And I'm sure that, a lot of you have seen this graph or something similar to it, but it really highlights the massive declines that we've seen in grassland bird populations overall, with about a third decrease in their population. A big reason for the decline in the Northeast is agriculture, the intensification of agriculture and farmland abandonment. So they really rely on agricultural landscapes, but those landscapes are also creating stressors for their continued success. The photo on the right is actually myself and my colleagues walking through forest that used to be a sheep pasture. So where we were hearing ovenbirds and black-throated blue warblers, we would have likely been hearing savanna sparrows and bobolinks if we had stood there 70 years before. And I love this quote by Bob Askins. Nearly all of New England's forests have grown up through the skeletons of abandoned farmland. So a big reason why agriculture is such a threat to grassland birds in the Northeast is because haying directly coincides with their breeding season. This is a chart that was generated from data that I helped to collect in my first field season working with bobolinks in the Adirondacks. So this is basically showing what type of activity we were seeing when and how many individuals we were seeing. So the larger the blobs, the more activity we were seeing. We started to notice that they were arriving in mid to late May By, really early in June, they were singing and chasing, which is usually consistent with setting up territories. By, early and mid-June, the females were whining, which is what they do when they're soliciting a mate. So it means that they're setting up nests, and nests will soon be active. And really during the peak of when we were seeing possible active nests and feeding behavior, the haying happened on that field, which is, pretty consistent with what we see across the study area and in Vermont. The reason why haying often coincides with the breeding season is because the nutritional content in grass and forage decreases really quickly once it's past its prime. So this chart shows the cost it took to overwinter beef cattle in Ontario. And as you move across the x-axis, you're getting later and later into the breeding season or into the summer. So you can see that the lowest cost to overwinter cattle happened right during that window when we were seeing nesting and feeding behavior. And then it pretty quickly gets much more expensive for farmers to feed their cattle and livestock because the nutritional content decreases. This is a great quote from one of the farmers that I talked to this summer. He said that feeding livestock late cut hay is sort of like asking humans to just eat the pizza box. He said that you could probably do it, but you wouldn't feel very good and you wouldn't be very productive after. So, how does this relate to the Adirondacks? How does this relate to an area where we have, huge tracts of protected forest land with small areas of farms that are kind of struggling to hang on? And this actually is the field in Lake Placid that I began my research on. Michaela Glennon and Ray Curran, who I've been working with for 3 years, they did this study in 2013 to compare habitats with their level of protection throughout the Adirondacks. And they found, if you focus to the right, that the wide gray bars are showing the percentage of that habitat that's protected under either state ownership or conservation easement. And the thin black line is showing the number of vertebrates that are threatened in those habitat types. So we can see that while alpine areas are heavily protected, grassland and agricultural areas have almost no private land or public land ownership from the state. So the DEC really can't do a lot to protect species on those lands. And they actually harbor a pretty large diversity of species. This just goes to show that, reaching out to private landowners and to farmers is so incredibly important if we want to protect grassland birds. Kind of by definition, wilderness areas and forest preserves will just not have a lot of hayfields in them, but the species that live and thrive in those habitats are declining and incredibly important. So I really wanted to do research in this area. I was able to secure funding to do 2 more field seasons after my first field season. So I was able to pursue this as a master's degree, which was incredible. And I decided to focus on 2 different things. First would be examining occupancy patterns of bobolink populations in respect to haying patterns in the Adirondacks. So to kind of get baseline information about where bobolinks are, how much are they moving around during the breeding season, and how intense is the current haying pattern. The second thing I wanted to do was really understand farmers' perspectives and capacity for adopting recommended management timelines. So I started out with point counts. I identified over 700 hayfields in the Adirondacks. And out of those 700 hayfields, I selected 120 that were over 10 acres in size and within 15 feet of a roadway. I tried to get a pretty large geographic distribution on those hayfields. But you can see that a lot are in the Champlain Valley because that's really where the majority of the habitat is. And I visited each of those 120 point count locations. 3 times during the breeding season, once during 3 separate monitoring blocks. The first monitoring block was in late May, and it was correlated with when bobolinks are establishing their territories. The second block was mid to late June, and that was correlating with peak breeding season. And then the final block, late June into early July, was correlating with fledging. So this basically meant getting up before the sun and going out in my car and parking alongside hay fields and getting out and counting all the birds and just writing down every bird that I saw or heard in that hayfield. So with that data, I'm going to do an occupancy model. And I actually haven't done the occupancy model yet, but I just generated this map quickly to kind of show you what occupancy modeling is and what it can tell us. So I mentioned that I visited each hayfield during 3 different monitoring blocks. In this chart, we're comparing the first monitoring block to the last. So if I saw or heard a bobolink in late May, it gets a 1. If I didn't, it gets a 0. And then the same rule goes for July. So if I went to that same location and I heard a bobolink, it gets a 1. If I didn't, it gets a 0. And from that, we can construct what's called an encounter history, which tells you if you saw one in both times or one of them or not at all. And this can tell you a lot about how much animals are moving. So if I saw a bobolink in May, but not in July, it's red, because we can assume that that bobolink left the site for some reason. If it established the site partway through the field season, it's yellow. And if I saw it both times, it's green. And then the no detections, the 0 zeros, are areas where we just didn't detect any. The model can give us a lot of really important information by using these encounter histories and pairing it with what we call covariates. So the model will take into account both site covariates and survey covariates. The site covariates were all generated in GIS, and those tell us characteristics of the site that might influence whether or not bobolinks will be there, like field size, surrounding landscape composition, haying intensity in the surrounding landscape, and the date of haying. The survey covariates I collected while I was doing the surveys, so time, date, temperature, wind speed, things that will all determine how active the birds are and how easy they are to see or hear. This kind of gets to, the likelihood that I would find a bird that was in that field. So this modeling will be able to tell us a lot about how much birds are being impacted by haying in the Adirondacks throughout the breeding season. So the surrounding landscape data was kind of cool. I generated it by drawing buffers around each of the point count locations and then using land cover data to find the percentage of that buffer area that was in either grassland, pasture, or hayfield. This tells us a lot about how isolated the hayfields are. We had a low of around 9%, which really is a very isolated hayfield, and a high of almost 50%. So we had a pretty high level of variation in the surrounding landscape makeup. Next, I found the timing of haying. I used what I call NDVI, which is Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. We use satellite imagery to find this. So as satellites fly over, they collect imagery that has a number of wavelengths. And when you rearrange the wavelengths, you can get what's called a false color image, which is what you see here. And those can tell you all kinds of things, but NDVI tells you specifically the health of plants on the ground. So by taking NDVI images of different dates and then comparing them, we can find the change in NDVI over the span of, a day or a week or a month. So this is showing you on the left the change in NDVI between May 18th and 23rd. And then on the right, it's showing you the exact same location. and the change between May 23rd and May 31st. The red areas are where you see dramatic drops in NDVI, which we associate with either haying or tilling. Some of these fields were cultivated, but I have information that tells me which ones are hay fields from the 700 hay fields that I manually digitized. So this was a lot of data cleaning and a lot of work, but it's really promising because it can generate a lot of information about haying that's really minimally invasive for the farmers and very efficient for researchers. We can cover a pretty large area using this type of methodology. So the timing of haying is really important because there are some recommended haying timelines that theoretically allow bobolinks to fledge in a field while farmers can make enough money to, keep their operations going. Really, any management has to be economically viable because, as I keep stressing, we really need farmers in order to protect grassland birds because, farmland abandonment is just as damaging for grassland birds as the intensification of haying. So these dates were found by Allan and Noah Perlett, which I'm sure a lot of you know both of those people. And they found that if farmers complete a first cut by May 31st and delay the second cut for 65 days, it allows them to get a high or a low volume, high quality cut early in the season, and then a cut with lower quality, but more stuff later in the season. And they found that actually worked for a lot of farmers in the Champlain Valley. Then another opportunity for compromise was to delay the first cut until July 15th. And I say that this is compromise because before this, the recommended haying timeline was to wait until August 15th, which for a lot of farmers is just not possible in our area. So, since many bobolinks and many grassland birds in general are really done with their breeding cycle by July 15th, we could cut a whole month off of that ask for farmers. But I wanted to know if these haying timelines worked across the lake, which even though it's not that far away, it's still a significant geographical difference. And, we have a whole elevational gradient that we're working alongside and, microclimates due to the mountains. So there were kind of a lot of different factors that could go into whether or not farmers could use these management guidelines on the other side of the lake. So to find out if those worked for farmers, I conducted semi-structured interviews. I did 20 of these, and I used what's called snowball sampling to identify my participants. That meant that I started with existing contacts and then had them connect me with people that they knew. I was initially a little bit worried that this would lead to me talking to people that all had the same perspectives, but I found very quickly that that wasn't the case. Because a lot of my initial contacts were people that had conservation easements with the land trust or, relationships with my friends and colleagues who worked in conservation work in the Adirondacks. But when they started recommending other contacts that they knew, they were recommending the person that hays their field, who would then pass me along to people that buy hay from them, who would then pass me along to their neighbor. So I very quickly rippled out into what I call the hay economy. And I was able to talk to people with really different perspectives. My interviews were 21 questions and they took between 15 minutes and over an hour, but most were around half an hour. And I was able to get funding to compensate the participants, which was really important to me because I wanted to pay them for their time and knowledge. So I had 21 questions, but I condensed them down into 6 so that you can kind of get the general idea of what I was asking. So I wanted to know what values are important to Adirondack farmers. What are the most important management considerations for Adirondack farmers? can farmers in the Adirondacks delay haying during the breeding season? What benefits and challenges arise from both of our suggested management timelines? What type of support is most helpful for Adirondack farmers who want to adopt bird-friendly haying timelines? And what level of trust do farmers have in various conservation organizations that work in this space? My hope was that this research could lead to tangible next steps for organizations in the Adirondacks and people that I had been working alongside for the years that I had been living there. I really wanted this to be something that could give back to that community and not just be another paper, but be, something that we could really build off of. So I generated a ton of information from this, and I really had to pare it down for this presentation, but a lot more of it will be in my thesis. So as far as landowner demographics, I collected the age and the amount of time they had been on their land and what type of marketable products they were selling. And I essentially broke the interviews into 4 different categories of person. So I called it participant type, and I used that to see if there were any trends across their answers. So self-suppliers were people that, supplied the majority of their own hay. These people often had diversified farms, they had multiple types of livestock, and they sold meat or dairy products as well as some value-added products like wool. The self-suppliers had enough land to both pasture their livestock and to create a lot of their own hay. And sometimes they had a slight excess that they would sell to neighbors, and sometimes they had a deficit and they would have to buy some in. Then we had the landowners, which were most of the people that I began the interviews with. These are people that own the land but don't actively farm it. But they have really important relationships with nearby farmers. Sometimes they're neighbors, sometimes they go back generations as handshake agreements. And these relationships really benefit the landowners because they're able to maintain their view, they're able to maintain the open nature of their land, and they're able to qualify for an agricultural tax credit on their land. And in return, the people that hay their land, have access to acreage that they don't actually have to own. So it's a really mutually beneficial relationship. I had a few people that I labeled as consumers because they had really focused operations that were focused on dairy or meat, and they didn't have the available land to create their hay for the winter. So they just pastured their livestock rotationally during the summer and then bought in all of their hay. Then I had producers who were kind of the other side of that coin. They told me that their main marketable product is hay, and they would often hay on multiple properties and sell that hay to horse owners, farms, and some even sold it out of state, which I was surprised by. Another thing I was surprised by is that 12 out of the 20 participants made less than 25% of their household income from farming. I know that everyone told me that you can't make money farming, but I was really shocked when I actually saw the numbers. So a lot of these people are not only farming, but they're also balancing, multiple other jobs and income streams. So I asked if farmers currently manage fields for grassland birds. And when I said that, I said, do you currently manage any fields on the 2 timelines that I mentioned? And actually almost half of them said that they already do, which I was really excited about. The reasons that they did varied pretty significantly. Some said, the fields don't get mowed for grassland birds, so they delay the mowing until they actually notice that all the grassland birds have fledged out of the fields. For others, it was logistics, not having enough machinery to get to all of their fields in time. But some also said that a pretty significant number said that they wouldn't consider delaying for grassland birds because they really had to get the hay when it was the most nutritious for their cattle, which is fair. And I think that this shows that, we don't have to get to everyone because there is enough opportunity with people who are already managing and would consider it. So when I asked if they hay, or if it would be possible to hay before the end of May and wait 65 days, the majority said no. That timeline really doesn't work in the Adirondacks because a lot of our locations are just high enough in elevation that they're not going to be able to get into their fields before the end of May. You can see that in the top quote saying, "In here in our specific location, we're never ever going to get a cutting of hay before May 31st. Other people had concerns about getting an early cut and, potentially not even being able to get an early cut because they couldn't get into their fields. And then also having to delay really into August for the second cut, which would just be really low quality. So for a lot of farmers in the Adirondacks, this just seemed like a really bad deal. And a lot of them also had concerns about weather. It was an unusually wet year, but a lot of them said that, due to rain, they just couldn't miss those weather windows in June, and they also likely couldn't get into fields that early. Then when I asked if they can delay until the middle of July, I had a much more positive response. Almost half, again, said that they could delay into July on some or all of their fields. So we had a few landowners that said that they always leave aside a field for bobolinks, or that they don't allow farmers to hay anything on their land for bobolinks. And these are people that really watch their fields and watch to see when the birds fledge from them. But a lot of people said that they just don't get to everything, and it's really pretty easy for them to leave something aside. And even saying that they would be able to leave aside a field intentionally for bobolinks. When I asked what type of support would be most helpful for farmers if they wanted to adopt, different management timelines to support grassland birds, overwhelmingly, the answer was financial support is what they need. I absolutely love this quote. Someone said, "Technical support and then some sort of financial mechanism that fairly and sufficiently rewards farmers for adding yet another level of complexity to things." And then he said, "I dream for a day when it's set up where you're almost out there looking for these things because there's some sort of mechanism to reward you for stewarding the land in a way that attracts them." I love the idea of like payment for birds because diversified farms are much more resilient. And it seems like, there's an opportunity to have farmers farming for bobolinks. And it seems like a lot of them are open to that. Additionally, something I didn't expect was the importance of relationships. So out of the 16 people that said that they needed financial support, 5 of them, which is a quarter of the total interviews, said that they needed it for someone else. So they either needed it to offset the lost income of the farmer that hayed their land, or they would need it to buy in additional hay for the people that they generally supply. So this is a really close-knit area, and relationships are really important. And it just really came through strongly how important it is to understand and respect and honor those relationships if organizations are stepping into this space. So a couple large themes that came through were challenges that are facing small North Country farms. It's incredibly difficult to farm in the North Country for a number of reasons. A lot of people talked about the reliance on markets downstate as kind of a limiting factor for them, having to produce value-added products and truck it down to New York City so that they can actually make enough money to support their farm. A lot of people talked about how most people just won't pay the true cost of food. We also are seeing a decline in agricultural infrastructure. So I talked to someone who previously worked in a company that was supporting farmers. And as the farmers diminished, that company went out of business. and then wasn't there to support all of the remaining farmers. So this can look like, not having access to compost because you have to truck it the whole way from Plattsburgh. It could look like not having places to fix machinery, and just proximity to businesses and to other farms is a huge advantage to a lot of these farmers. Many of them voiced concerns about climate uncertainty. Again, I was doing this fieldwork and these interviews during one of the rainiest summers we've had in a long time. I practically was flooded out of my final monitoring block by the flooding that happened in July. So a lot of farmers are really aware of the changes in weather patterns, and it was a terrible year for hay production this year. Finally, the increasing cost of land is really raising the barrier to entry for new farmers. So as older farmers are aging out, it's harder and harder for young people to realize their dream of farming in the Adirondacks. So thinking about the next 50 years, since we started this presentation talking about how bobolinks are a tipping point species, if we don't want to lose the next 50% in the next 50 years, if I could just wave my magic wand, which I'm hoping to do in my career, these are the things that I would really tackle. Compensation for ecosystem services, which we're already doing in a lot of ways. There are programs that are compensating farmers for, soil and water quality and farming for birds, also payments for climate resiliency. Supporting local farms, keeping our dollars, in our community. When I shop at the farmer's market, which is hard to do as a grad student, I always just think that I'm paying for my food, but I'm also paying for the farms to continue existing. And it's kind of like voting with our dollars. Empowering new farmers. Quite a few of the farms that I talked to mentioned a specific organization as the reason why they were able to get their farms in the first place. And this was an organization that works to lower the barrier to entry by helping farmers actually buy their land. So I feel like there are so many ways that we can empower new farmers and encourage people to take up this career, because it's really challenging but really important. And finally, strengthening local food systems. I like to think of this little bubble of the Champlain Valley and how we can really try to exist in this bubble and strengthen it and empower our farmers and make sure that everyone has accessible and affordable food. And that would really just go back to protecting bobolinks and enabling farmers to adapt their management timelines. If we don't do those things, current predictions don't look good right now. We know that there should be an increased conflict between haying timelines and the breeding season due to climate change. Research has come out that shows that farmers are moving their haying forward, but bobolinks aren't adjusting their migration. So we can expect that conflict will intensify with the breeding season, and we may start to have to reevaluate the timelines that we're using. And this might be, continual research that has to happen to make sure that the timelines that we're, encouraging farmers to adopt are still the timelines that will be most beneficial to birds and most economically viable for them. Without further intervention, we can expect to see continued nationwide declines. But I see a lot of hope here, which is why I'm on this path and I chose this as my career. I see that there are new funding opportunities available to nonprofits that want to tackle programs like this. Because a lot of recent research has come out about declines in grassland birds, I've noticed that grassland birds have been included in requests for proposals through existing funding agencies. We also have new pots of funding that are coming up, like the solar mitigation funds in New York. So I think that while it feels slow, change is coming and help is coming. And that will lead to program development and capacity building on the nonprofit um, level. So a couple organizations that I really love and that give me a lot of hope are the Bobolink Project, Ag Allies, and the Grassland Bird Trust. And I wanted to mention that, really anyone can help here. So as a board member for Northern New York Audubon, I helped them to start our farm grant. And we just hosted trivia events. We released a mead that was farm themed. And we raised $5,000 that we gave to 5 different farms in $1,500 grants. Some were a little smaller. And we basically started this grant to provide funding and education to farmers in our area. So all it really takes is one person. And I've actually heard back from some of those farmers, and they were really excited. And they told me about all the new birds that they were seeing on their properties, and how helpful it was to just have someone to kind of partner with, and someone that believed in them and was supporting them. This research would not have been possible without a whole community rallying behind me. But Northern New York Audubon and the Eline Foundation provided funding, and Asgard Farm and Daisy Meadow let me stay on their properties while I was doing my field season. And I'm just so grateful for the support of this community, and it's exciting to be able to put this research out into the world and hope that it really comes back to a lot of those people and to that community. I hope it can lead to change for grassland birds and our farmers. And here are my references. I would love to answer any questions.
Well, as it happens, a question just popped up. First of all, on behalf of the other side of the lake, Chittenden County, Grand Isle, and Franklin County, Green Mountain Audubon, thank you very much. I learned a lot. I'm sure we all did. And I just think it is amazing and exciting that you have found a path, and that path leads geographically through a couple different areas that are close to us and dear to our hearts, as well as to birds, which are equally dear to our hearts. Our first question, so for the participants, the way we work our questioning is we're not going to open up the video or the audio as we had problems a couple years ago, but you have the ability to type into the chat. So on the bottom of your screen, you'll see chat. And if you click on that on the right-hand sidebar, you'll see group meeting chat. And then you can type your questions into that, and I will relay them to Hyla. The first one, Hyla, is, do these Bobolink grants, are they available for town-owned fields?
That's interesting. Well, I think it would depend on which grant. There are some available through national sources, like the CRP funding, and I don't know I don't think that would be available to town fields. But something like the Bobolink project, it might, allow a town field to be in their program. I think you would just have to meet certain requirements, like, following those management timelines. You would just have to find funding sources that didn't require you to be like, financially a farm. But I think that, future funding sources should absolutely be open to as many different types of landowners as possible. Because as I was mentioning, a lot of farmers have, real limitations for participating in these programs. So I think, I would hope that the answer would be yes.
We have a follow-up to that, and the same person made an observation, and she says, I thought Bobolink project was for farm owned.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not affiliated with the Bobolink project, so I don't know the back end of their regulations, but I just really respect their model. I know that they've put, 1,000 acres under this protection, which is incredible. And I think that that's a great thing to bring up. And, a lot of these programs, especially ones within nonprofits, it's a lot easier to change the requirements than it is at the federal level. So, I would say reach out and just form that connection and see where it goes from there.
This one is much more about bobolinks. Would bobolinks nest in a field covered with solar panels, assuming the ground cover was favorable?
That's a great question. And there's current research that's happening in Cornell to examine that exact question. It's not published yet, so we really don't have a lot of information. But the current assumption is no. Of course, it depends on the spacing, but bobolinks are really edge averse and they don't like to be in shade. They can tolerate, a few trees in a field, but I think a solar array would feel like a forest to them. So, they really want to be out in the open where they feel safe from predators. And I think that solar arrays are probably going to impact their breeding and even, settling in a field.
Thank you. The next question is just kind of a suggestion, and it's from our former president, Bruce McPherson. Does partial harvesting of hay fields make any sense? Sort of like rotation of crops?
Yes, I think so. It's something that I talk to a lot of these farmers about. And, the obvious concern would be patch size. Predation is a big concern for bobolinks. So if you know that there's an active nest and you mow around it, if you're mowing right around it, the crows are still probably going to predate that nest. But if you leave a large enough patch, they're not going to abandon a nest once it's established and once they're feeding young. So they'll probably stay there as long as they possibly can. Another thing that I would recommend for farmers to do is, either pay attention to fields and avoid areas that are the highest level of activity. Bobolinks are semi-colonial nesters, so you'll typically find a lot of them in a smaller area. So you may have one field where, it's full of bobolinks and then another where you really don't have that many. And they typically congregate on the higher parts of the field. So if you're able to mow around the edges, they won't usually nest in the edges, within like 100 feet of the forest edge. And then additionally, if you're able to mow in the lower parts of the field, that would be recommended.
Thank you. You are generating all sorts of activity, young lady. The next one is, do you know of efforts to preserve grassland tracts in northern New York or in Vermont?
I'm assuming you mean contiguous tracts, like organized efforts to group together fields.
I don't know if that's in the question. I think the question is not so much like the Bobolink project, which can pay the farmers, but are the efforts to preserve the grassland tracts themselves, the land, are there any efforts in northern New York or Vermont that kind of focus more on preservation of the land?
None that I know of. I mean, we do have some areas that are owned by the state, but not many. Most of the state-owned lands are forests. And then, land trusts, I would say, are the big ones that could be doing that type of work, protecting fields, for the value for grassland birds. And I'm on the New York State working group for grassland birds. So we're trying to figure out how we can protect them and how we can kind of generate like connections between organizations. And I'm on a land trust subgroup. So that's the area where I really feel the most hope for organized conservation for grassland birds. I think up until now, that hasn't really been a priority among land trusts, but it is becoming one.
We have a couple more questions. Yay for questions. The next one, you kind of mentioned it when you said that the bobolinks are not arriving later as a response to climate change. And the question that has been posed is, are their breeding seasons itself also shifting?
We're not seeing evidence of that, which is where the conflict lies. So, farmers are likely going to delay earlier and earlier. So asking them to delay until the end of the breeding season will become a bigger and bigger ask.
Mhm.
We aren't yet seeing that bobolinks are, changing their migration timing because of climate change. They're a hemispheric migrant, so they're basically in year-round summer. They go down to the grasslands in South America, and then they actually start migrating while it's late summer there. They're migrating up here, so I think the cues for migration are much different for them than the cues that farmers are using to hay their fields.
That makes a lot of sense. One participant says, I have been contributing to the Bobolink project through Mass Audubon for quite a few years. Is there something currently in place for farmers in Vermont? I guess that's more directed to the Bobolink project.
Yeah, the Bobolink Project, I mean, I'm not a representative of that organization, but they do cover fields in Vermont. They also cover fields in New York. I monitored a field with Allan in New York in Westport that was under the Bobolink Project. So they do work in states outside of Massachusetts.
And one last question that I see is, in terms of suggested or encouraged timelines, how is that information currently being disseminated to farmers on either side of the lake? And are there any plans to have town halls or other meetings to talk about these timelines directly to the farmers?
That's a great question. I feel like at this time we're kind of preaching to the choir. I know that there often is much more demand for enrollment than programs can support, whether that's the Bobolink Project or land trusts, taking on conserved lands. So right now we don't really have the problem of needing to reach out to additional farmers, but I absolutely think that we should. Because what I was finding is that just the education is valuable. Even if we don't necessarily have the funding to enroll every farmer, if we can teach them about grassland birds and teach them about the birds that are using their fields and haying timelines and just put that in their mind, there's a chance that they could alter their haying, year to year or field to field. So the answer is no. I don't think town halls are happening, but that would basically be my dream job. I would love to be able to increase education to farmers, and I would love to hear, other ideas. I've definitely used the Cornell Cooperative Extension Network to get information to farmers, and I think that we need to do a little bit more of that.
We have a observation which kind of harks back to your roots of where you grew up. The person said, this is off topic, but I left Lancaster County 45 years ago because it was so discouraging to see so many valuable farmland being covered by trucking terminals and warehouses. And I know it's so much worse today. But as your presentation showed, there's a lot of hope for the future. And one of the biggest sources of hope, in my opinion, are dedicated researchers such as yourself. We have a couple more questions, and I'm going to tell our audience that we're approaching 7:30. So type in the questions, and I will pick some of them. You're getting lots and lots of thank yous. Also in the chat, you will see that Pat has put in our link for membership and donations. And I will tell you that when we did our programs in person, we would literally pass a hat. And not only are we going to thank Hyla, but we're going to thank you for attendance, but we would appreciate your support because the funds that we raise through our donations for our outings and our programs are used in particular for educational programs for disadvantaged youth. For example, we just bought a whole set of binoculars for one of the elementary schools in Burlington, and the need is growing, and we would love to have your support. So now we're getting the thank yous, Hyla. So thank you for an informative and interesting presentation. Good luck with your research. Good luck, great research. Hyla, let me just take this moment before we end to say I was thrilled that Liza reached out to you, and you are an excellent presenter. We wish you all the best in your master's thesis, and please keep in touch, and we would love to have you present another time, perhaps an update on your research. So thank you very much. And to all who gave some of their time here and listened to Hyla's presentation, we wish you a good evening, and don't look outside, think spring. Okay, Hyla, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. And our next presentation is also going to be a young woman scientist. We're very excited. She's been working on the Palmyra Atoll and is going to talk to us about seabirds. And we wrap up the season with Zach Coda, who's going to do a presentation on rare birds in Vermont. Again, thank you, Hyla. Have a
Thanks
good
for having
evening.
me.
Thank you, everyone. Good night now.